Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 1 game from the Xtracon Open. So before I actually get into this game, I want to talk a little bit about this tournament. Obviously, I just finished the New York International. There was actually about a week in between, and now I'm actually in Denmark. If you don't know, I'm actually half Danish. My dad was born in Denmark and raised there, and my parents actually met on vacation in Jamaica, of all places. But basically, my whole dad's side of the family is actually in Denmark, so I actually go there typically about once or twice a year to see my grandparents, my cousins, aunts and uncles, and so on, and it's always a really great experience. And I actually studied abroad in Copenhagen my entire junior year, and that was actually a really coming-of-age period for me, because I really got to ingratiate myself even more with Danish culture, get better at speaking the language. Because frankly, when I was growing up, I would typically go there for the most of the summer and every other Christmas. But I really was just, coming and going, and really, studying abroad in Denmark actually really helped quite a bit and really captured and reinforced my love of Denmark and Copenhagen and the like. And to be honest, I've actually considered moving there at some point, because I think just the quality of life in Denmark is quite high for most people, and I just am always happy when I'm there. So, I mean, granted, I've never worked in Denmark, so part of it is also, going somewhere and always being on vacation is also definitely affects that mindset a little bit, as opposed to being in like the real world grind of the day to day. But something about the, Denmark and the culture and everything just really appeals to me just from a philosophical perspective. I really like the way they take care of their own. I like that people are biking everywhere. I just particularly in Copenhagen, I like the urban aspect of it. Anyway, so just to speak about the Xtracon Open in particular, my grandfather in Denmark actually is about an 1800 chess player, and I would actually come every summer and play tons and tons of blitz games with him. And it was just always a great bonding experience where we'd come and talk chess and play chess, and that bond has continued to live on, even though I'm obviously much stronger than him now. And it's just always a great thing to go to Denmark and actually play this tournament with him, because he actually plays in the event as well. So it's actually a really great pleasure to, play in a tournament where your grandfather's also participating and hang out and just have that experience together. And my grandmother, actually, she's not a chess player at all, but I actually taught her how to follow the moves, and at least I taught her how to follow the evaluations on Chess Bomb, which is normally where, big international tournaments are broadcasted. And so she can kind of see from the evaluations how the position is going, what I'm doing. And she tends to follow this, and it's kind of a really cool thing where even though, she doesn't really know that much about, the intricacies of chess, she's able to understand kind of what's going on, or at least what the truth of the position is. And it's just a fun bonding moment. Anyways, in 2018, when I played the Xtracon Open, I actually had one of the best tournaments of my life. It was actually a few weeks after my first Grandmaster norm in 2018. I got my first GM norm in June of 2018, and then I played this event in July, and I actually needed a draw going into the last round to secure a GM norm last year. I was playing Grandmaster Niels Grandelius from Sweden with white in the last round, and I was better most of the game, but made a really critical blunder that turned the game, and I eventually lost. And it was just a really, really tough game and a tough experience just to go through that when you're so close and you don't get there. And essentially, I tend to play well in the Xtracon Open, so I wanted to come back this year and, hopefully, put it all together. So that's a little bit of context of this tournament. And without further ado, let me get into it. So my opponent in this one was an untitled player by the name of Morten Rasmussen. Typically in these events, you do play down a few rounds before playing up, especially because it's a big open, and a lot of Danish players playing it, of course. So yeah, that's just the way it is. So and also the thing that's interesting about this tournament is it's actually 10 rounds. So, typically you have 9-round events. This one's 10. So you play 1 game a day and then 2 games on the second day. So the tournament lasts 9 days. Anyways, without further ado, I was white. Let me get into it. So I'm with D4, standard practice for me. And black played D5. And then I played knight F3. And after knight F6, I went for C4. So I was essentially not sure whether he was going to go for Queen's Gambit declined or an accepted or a Slav. But I would soon find out when he played C6. And that told me that he's either going to do a Slav or a semi-Slav setup. But, the C6 and D5 pawns tell me, okay, it's a Slav-ish type of position. I decided to play E3. This has been a move that I've utilized quite a bit against Slav setups. There are lines where if black goes for bishop F5 and knight C3, E6, white can get the bishop pair with knight H4 and hunt this bishop down and actually win it. And typically, white has a slight positional plus based on the bishop pair, and that's the type of position that's kind of in my wheelhouse, so I don't mind those types of positions. But in this game, my opponent went for E6, and E6 actually characterizes the semi-Slav. So having this triangle of pawns means that the bishop actually doesn't get out of the chain and typically winds up going to B7 and developing there. So usually the most popular move in this position is actually go knight C3, and after knight BD7, bishop D3, D takes C4, bishop takes C4, B5. This is kind of standard fare in the semi-Slav where the bishop eventually comes to B7. This pawn formation is typically reinforced with A6 at some point, and then black prepares a C5 break in the middle to kind of open up the bishop on the long diagonal and get counterplay against white's center. And many of the positions in this variation, have theory that goes to move 20 or so, and there are many forcing lines here. So frankly, I've actually never been too fond of this setup for white because it seems like it's a lot of times like a memorization battle, and I don't really enjoy that type of exercise. So instead of playing knight C3, what I usually do when I play semi-Slavs, I usually go for sidelines, and in this one I decided to play bishop D3. Now, bishop D3 is not the most popular move by a long shot. I believe it's the 3rd most popular move in this position behind knight C3 and B3. But the idea here is to keep the knight on B1 for a time and kind of wait to see what black is going to do. Typically in those other lines, the semi-Slav that I talked about with knight C3, knight B7, and then this capture, the knight on C3 is sometimes a bit of a nuisance for white because B4 can always harass the knight uncomfortably from that square. So sometimes it's actually kind of nice to just keep the knight pinned back for a moment just so that B4 doesn't come as a form of harassment. And okay, obviously B4 doesn't happen right away because one of the things that you want to be a little bit wary of is playing B4 and weakening the A4, C4 squares too quickly. But the point is that the threat of B4 in some positions discourages white from actually going E4 because a lot of times the E4 pawn is not as well protected. If the bishop is on B7 and there's maybe a pawn on C5 or something like this, then B4 is really problematic because it, allows the black to try to wrestle control over the really important E4 square. So because of that, I just try to get a little bit of a remix on this with bishop D3. Now after bishop D3, there are actually 2 more popular moves than the one my opponent made, and I think it's in part maybe because he was unfamiliar with this position that he made a move that I don't actually deem to be very accurate. So he actually played A6 here, and this move I believe is to be a mistake, honestly, because it doesn't really contribute very much to the nature of the structure. Now, if the knight was on C3, yeah, at some point, A6 actually does happen. I'm going to back up once again and show that in these particular lines, like after bishop D3, A6 is actually a move here. And the point is that black prepares C5 and is actually protecting the B5 pawn. The issue with playing a6 though in the way that he did is that he hasn't actually taken the pawn on c4, so I can actually reinforce this pawn and not allow him to get b5 with a tempo on my bishop. And because of that, I actually just played b3, and I think this move makes a6 kind of ineffective, because now if you take on c4, I could take with the b pawn, and the situation as it stands now makes a6 kind of a useless move, because now if you play b5, you're not actually challenging the bishop on d3, and so I'm not actually going to take and help black structure, and this pawn structure is a little bit weak because he didn't get a tempo for it, and I just have a nice stable center. And in this particular version, I could even entertain the move c5, kind of shutting down these pawns if I wanted to. But I think either way, white has a pretty pleasant position because d takes c4 was not played, and so white didn't have to recapture with the bishop. And so instead of a6, the two moves that are more popular are knight bd7, just keeping with the traditional semi-Slav lines, or d takes c4 right away. And after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, now we have a position, that's quite original, where, as I've demonstrated with the arrows, my knight doesn't necessarily have to go to c3. It can actually go to d2, and in some lines not be harassed by eventual b5 and b4. But I think these positions would be more playable than the one after a6. After a6 and b3, black went for knight bd7, and my argument here, again, is that this move a6 is kind of ineffectual and gives them a tempo down on a lot of critical lines. And this would actually prove to be kind of important, because now with b3, we've switched to the e3 and b3 lines of the semi-Slav, which are fairly positional in nature and wrestle with the control of the e5 square. And the issue is that I get really good control of the e5 square before black does. So I now went castles, and after bishop d6, bishop b2. And the issue here is that in many of these lines with b3 and e3, black's actually trying to play e5 as a pawn break. But the issue is that I have three pieces trained against that break, making it, impossible at the moment. And this feature, is quite problematic, because if black doesn't get to play e5 and break out in the position, he's kind of going to be squeezed. And so one of these breaks, c5 or e5, needs to really be executed, and it's typically e5. Now, the reason c5 is not as attractive is because the knight is on d7 instead of c6. So it's not actually, if it was on c6, it'd actually be hitting the d4 pawn. On d7, it's actually kind of dominated by my d pawn. So after c5, yeah, he's hitting this pawn, but he can't really build up on that pressure, and that's kind of a problem. So the knight on d7 is actually a little misplaced for the c5 break, and that's why e5 is typically the move here. So essentially, these are all really, really important factors and play a part in why white is better. After bishop b2, black castled, and now I went knight bd2, and this is essentially the idea in the b3 and e3 versions of the semi-Slav is the knight goes to d2 to ensure that white still has good control over the e5 square and doesn't block the bishop. And the other benefit of the knight on d2 is it's still eyeing e4, so it's stopping black from just putting a knight on e4 and getting a ton of like Dutch stonewall type of structure that can be prevalent in this position. So you can see here e5 is not really happening, knight e4 is not really happening, and this is really problematic. Now here I think my opponent made another mistake with the move rook e8. And the idea makes sense. He really wants to play e5. He wants to break with e5 and liberate his position. And even at the cost of an isolated pawn, this would sometimes be sensible, because after e5, there's some times where I can take on d5 and, force e takes d5 or knight takes d5. But the point is, it's really important for him to get this activity. And typically the counterplay on the king side with the e5 break facilitates the development of all of his minor pieces, and so it's a really important break. The issue here is I don't have to allow it, and I actually just stop this by playing knight e5. And this is the other critical reason why the knight on d2 is not on c3, because the bishop is still reinforcing the square. And so now with the knight on e5, he can't actually break on e5, and the rook on e8 is also ineffectual. So instead of rook e8, a better move would have been b6 or c5. Again, this break with c5 is not ideal, but at least it's something, and you need to try and develop the light squared bishop in some type of way. So that's why this is a better try, even though white would be better placed for this break. If you just look at the position right now, it's actually nearly completely symmetrical, but the difference is that my bishop is already on b2, and that's really the only difference in the position. The bishop on b2, and then I guess I have b3 and a2, and he has a6 and b7, and everything else is symmetrical. But that little difference is actually huge, because it means that I'm just simply ahead in a position where he can't mix it up dynamically without making his position worse. So that's kind of the problem here. So after rook e8, knight e5, the other thing that you have to think about this rook e8 move is it makes f7 just a touch sensitive. And, you'd think, that maybe doesn't become a feature in the position. But as long as this knight is on e5 actually eyeing f7, it's absolutely an issue. And the other issue is that taking this knight is not actually possible. So if you play knight takes e5, after d takes e5, there's just a fork on the bishop and the knight. And if you take with the bishop, unfortunately, after d takes e5, not only does white have the bishop pair, but this knight on f6 actually has no squares except e4. And this is hugely problematic, because after knight e4, I can simply take on e4 and have a massive, massive advantage, being a pawn up, having more space. Note that the d6 square is a massive square for my knight, a massive outpost, and I'll also have really good attacking chances on the king side. So this position is just losing. And you can see how a6 and c6 really hem the light squared bishop in for black. So yeah, just not a nice position. And yeah, that's why it's actually really, really bad. After knight e5, black tried to break out now with c5, and it's a good attempt. I mean, given now that my knight is, on e5, you need to try and undermine the protection of that knight and open up some lines, because if you get choked out, it's just game over. So this makes some sense. But now, I mean, obviously, with the bishop still on c8, with his rooks not close to being connected, white is for choice, and I can try to press this a little bit more. And I thought for a while here about ways to do that. One move I was considering was knight df3, eyeing the all-important g5 square potentially, and, thinking about the f7 square. But I didn't like in this position that in some lines knight e4 might be playable, because I don't really want to take with my bishop necessarily. And I didn't like that he might be able to... I just didn't like knight e4, basically. I'm trying to make up another reason why I didn't like it. But there are certain positions where I didn't like this knight coming to e4, because bishop takes e4, d takes e4 would destabilize my knight, and I wouldn't be able to jump to g5 because the queen would be guarding that square. So instead, I actually decided to play a little bit more aggressively, and somewhat uncharacteristically, I went for the move f4. But I actually felt it was completely justified just because of the rook on e8 and this pawn on a6. I thought that, black was so woefully behind on the typical lines in this position that I could afford to be quite aggressive here, even though it's not in my style to, push my f-pawn and create, long-term weaknesses like on e3 right now and on e4. But I felt that, I really ought to play with the initiative here given my space advantage. So after f4, the position's actually really critical, and black played b6, trying to develop the bishop. And the position's actually already +1 for white, because I have so many great attacking prospects with the bishops lined up like this. The diagonals can open at any moment, and a knight on e5. And the most precise way to play here, believe it or not, is actually to play rook f3. Now, this is a move I didn't play, and, I guess I did play f4, but rook f3 is really not in my style at all. But the issue for black is that this rook h3 move is really strong, and just gives really, really strong pressure on the h-pawn. So just a sample line, if bishop b7, rook h3, and you might say, oh, now the bishops on b7 and d6 are actually quite good. You might be able to get some play. But the issue is that a move like c takes d4, for instance, trying to resolve some of the tension in the center and maybe saddle me with hanging pawns, I wouldn't recapture on d4, but I'd instead play the move bishop h7 check. And apparently this position is just completely lost. They're basically in conjunction with queen h5. I'm hitting f7 and h7, and then also sometimes threatening mate on h8. It's just too much. So amazing resource here, but just kind of shows you what white has in store. Instead, after b6, I played the second best move, and also just a very good move, and still very reasonable, is knight df3. And my idea here was to not completely go for broke with rook h3 and just go for knight g5, because at the end of the day, if my knight is able to get to g5 and hit f7, that's very strong. And well, I think that I also have very good pressure in this position as well, but I'm not burning all the bridges with rook f3. Because the thing is, if rook f3 doesn't work, like if for some reason I don't see bishop h7 and I don't play those tactics completely accurately, my center is going to collapse quite quickly with a few exchanges, and it's black that actually has the better structural integrity right now. So just from a pawn structure perspective. So if you don't want to kind of go for broke, this is kind of the more sensible thing to do. So after knight df3, knight e4 was played, and this is actually the losing move. If black wanted to try to stay in the game, h6 needed to be played to cover the g5 square, but this position is still extremely difficult. I mean, I have a lot of decent prospects here. I can shift the queen over if I want to an attacking post. I can play rook c1 and just trade my pieces in the center. I can consider taking on d7 and playing knight e5 again. There's still a lot of attacking ideas here, and positional ideas, but knight e4 loses right away because he didn't manage to protect the g5 square. And that's the other reason I played f4, is because now my knight, once it goes to f3, is actually supported by my f-pawns. That was one of the ideas here. And actually now I don't even have to get super tactical. I can just play logical moves, because after bishop takes e4 and d takes e4, I played the move knight g5, which is just decisive. The issue here is that not only am I threatening queen h5, the immediate threat's just knight takes f7, and also knight takes e4. So just everything is hanging. And even though I gave up my bishop, you can see this bishop on b2 can spring into life at any moment because of the pawn tension on c5 and d4, and there are just too many threats. So yeah, the position is actually just collapsing. So after f5 was played, but let's just say bishop takes e5 is played, I actually can just go d takes e5, and you can see e4 still hanging. Queen h5 is a threat. This bishop, even if it gets to b7, will be shut out by its e4 pawn now, which is a problem because it's kind of just not a good bishop, and all these threats are just too much. So you can't defend all of them, and it's just tough. So this position would just be lost. I mean, if h6, knight takes e4, and the knight comes to d6, and that's decisive. And yeah, just not a good position. If I want to be fancy, after bishop takes e5, I actually don't even have to recapture. I can play queen h5. And actually, the threat of taking on f7 and h7 is too much. For instance, if bishop f6, queen takes h7, check, king f8, and d5 is actually just nearly mate, because if bishop takes b2, I actually played d6, and now the king is shut out, lock and key from getting out of the position with queen h8 mate. And if knight f6, queen h8, knight g8, knight h7 is a beauty, where the king is just locked in a terrible cage on the back rank. So yeah, there are many ways to win this game, and of course I choose kind of the one that doesn't require any crazy fireworks, but there were fireworks at my disposal. So anyways, after knight g5, Morten played f5, which does protect the e4 pawn, but doesn't address the threats in the position with knight f7 and queen h5, and those are actually more important than the pawn. So this pretty much leads to a swift end after the move knight e f7. Now again, I can throw in queen h5 and do some fancy stuff, but I saw that knight e f7 was actually quite efficient and forcing because I'm hitting the queen and the bishop with tempo. So the queen has to move and defend the bishop. And now after knight takes d6 and queen takes d6, now I threw in queen h5 because I have a double attack on h7 and e8. So it's another forcing move for which there's only one really reasonable reply, the move knight f6, which defends both of these pieces temporarily. And then I'd seen a tactic from a few moves ago in this position that I visualized and, was able to win from here very swiftly. So I'm actually going to give you the chance to find it. White to move and just win the game very cleanly on with a two-move combination. White to move. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and mull over the continuation. It's not super complicated. My tactics rarely are, but the move that just wins very simply is queen f7 check. And it's another forcing move, and to which there's only one reply, king h8. And then, now I can actually, play d takes e5 and bishop takes f6. But even faster and more efficient is queen takes f6. And after this move, my opponent actually just resigned because after g takes f6, knight f7 check, I, am winning a full piece because I recapture on d6 and get my queen back. Again, there was also queen takes e8 here and knight f7, but here I'm actually only winning an exchange instead of a piece. So I thought this move was a little bit stronger, but in any case, you can see here that there are many, many ways to win. And if you just stare at this position here, white has an overwhelming edge before the tactic. My rooks are connected. I have better development, obviously. My king is safer. I have good control of the center. And all those things matter. So I think, if you just go back to the opening, this move a6 in conjunction with rook e8 was fatal. And it's amazing how just a few slips is the difference between winning and losing in chess, and that's why chess can be such a cruel game at times. But anyways, I did my job. I won in round one. On to the next. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.